rather unique Zoom meeting. Let me introduce to you Dr. Josh Ramirez. He is an expert in behavioral program management, which may be a little foreign to some of us, and that's exactly why we're having a presentation here today about it, to let Josh talk about this. This was well received. I can tell you he's done it before at the NDIA IPM division. It was very well received, and I was there. So I jumped on him afterwards and introduced myself and asked him if he could help us at some point. Very delayed, right, Josh?
A little bit.
For a workshop at CPM. We're a little more focused this year in 2024. We want to offer more on a monthly basis. A workshop, a webinar, a chat discussion, a panel discussion. So I'd like to have everybody's attention on that as we move forward into the year of 2024. So with all that stated, I'm Dan Lynch. I'm the Vice President of Workshops at CPM. And if any of you out there, or if you watch it later, please feel free to give me your ideas as to what we should do for a workshop in the future. I'm open to all ideas. While Josh is speaking, let's try to make sure everybody's got their mics muted. And I don't know how Josh wants to operate. Would you like the questions live? Would you like them at the end? Would you like them in the chat?
I like an engaged audience. If you have a question as I'm talking about anything, let's just talk about it right then,
Cool.
right now.
Cool. I love it.
Before you forget, right? Because then you wait till the end. Sometimes you forget it.
It's true. That's true. Well, with all that stated, I want to thank you, Josh, for being here. My sincerest gratitude. And
I appreciate
with that stated, you're on, brother.
All right. Let's see if I can get a successful screen share here. How are we working?
Solid.
All right.
I got it.
Now let's just make sure I can see my teams at the same time. So, as Dan was stating before, this is kind of the intro to behavioral project management. It's a little bit unknown in some circles, but more known in others. And we'll discuss that a little bit. But basically, what it comes down to is, in its most simple, is designing project management around the brain. And so I'll get into that a little bit. The totally new in general, because they've been doing this in economics and finance and other technical disciplines. And so it's mostly new to project management more than it is new to any other disciplines. Project management is essentially a little bit behind the times. So we're trying to catch them up. Before we go on, I did want to show you a couple of pictures, because I always have, well, not always, but sometimes there's this assumption is like someone hears this title, Dr. Josh, and they're like, well, what could he possibly know about anything to do with project management in the real world? He's a cognitive scientist. But no, I started off in as a cowboy in Montana. That's where I grew up, herding cows, 21,000 acres, 700 head of cattle, 100 miles of fence line to run. It was quite work growing up. So I started off as essentially a cowboy in Montana, and then got into there's a picture of me and my wife when I was in the military, and me on horse with my sister and our kind of like adopted grandpa on that far upper left-hand corner, and that's the ranch in the center. But so yeah, so I got into the Army, and then a bunch of odd jobs and stuff, and then decided to get my degree when I got out of the Army. Ended up in project controls at Pacific Northwest National Lab. So it's been a quite a journey where I started off in project management and project controls, and is essentially kind of moved into cognitive science by accident. And the accident was I kept seeing that there was kind of a lot of issues with project performance that weren't explained or fixed by purely technical processes. And so that drove me to talking to my friend, Dr. Jody Wilson, who was a behavioral scientist. And she would kind of point to her head and say, well, do they have one of these? And I'd say, well, yeah. Then she's like, well, then it's a behavioral science problem, right? And so I started digging into cognitive biases, which are not just stereotypes and prejudice, but also other cognitive biases that are related to planning or risk or what have you. It's essentially just um, defaulted thinking that sometimes leads to errors. And so that led me into my research and getting my doctorate, and I took this complete pivot from project controls and earned value and scheduling and forecasting to how does behavioral science kind of fit into project management. And you would be surprised at how many ways it is. Before we go on, there was because of all the AI, artificial intelligence talk these days, what I wanted to kind of point out up front is that there is this um, big connection between artificial intelligence and human intelligence. And with the advent of AI, essentially what we have is now an even greater need for a focus on the HI, the human intelligence part, because as decision making becomes more forefront to a lot of us, because AI may be taking a lot of the mundane tasks away, we have to have more intelligent decision making. And so that human intelligence component is very relevant right now. But human intelligence is found in the study of human behavior, which is studied in behavioral science. So this connection of behavioral project management becomes even more relevant. You just kind of have to make that connection between the sciences that give us the intelligences and then how that fits into the project management paradigm. So here's a few brain facts for you. Your brain has about 100 billion neurons, processes information at very high speeds, uses 20% of your body, which is crazy, and has about 2,500 terabytes of storage. So your brain is, in many cases, um, smarter than AI. Uh, AI obviously has access to a lot of information, but your brain is very powerful. So we have to recognize that up front. So what is behavioral project management? Essentially, it's combining behavioral and neuroscience with project management to create this discipline we call behavioral project management. It's very dynamic. There's a whole lot more depth than you would kind of assumed hearing the word behavioral. For example, when you hear the word behavioral, some people may think of emotional intelligence. They may think of communication or leadership. It's actually way deeper than that. So I was talking a few minutes ago about the whole behavioral economics, behavioral finance. We have a huge benchmark to go off of. We don't have to start or have not started behavioral project management all on its own. We're able to use the science that's already been used in other disciplines and then just kind of aggregate that into one um, essentially discipline. So there's already, several Nobel Prize winners, Daniel Kahneman, Richard Thaler, who have done work in combining behavioral science with other technical disciplines such as economics, finance, marketing. There's neuromarketing, all these various different technical disciplines who have blended it. So we don't have to start from essentially. Also, there's a lot of studies in the behavioral sciences that are applicable to project management that had just never been really kind of pulled out of the academic databases and applied. We've been doing a lot of that as well. So why is it important? And that's because behavioral science gets results. And I'm not going to read through all of these, but you can see as an example here that behavioral science in general applied across various disciplines actually improves behavior and improves decision making. So it actually has meaningful outcomes. It's not just a nice to have, that can actually change outcomes. And so that's very important to project management, especially given the kind of failure stats that we have in projects in general, mega projects, government projects, et cetera. And then believe me, I've seen a lot of those, as I'm sure you all have as well. And behavioral science or behavior, human behavior in general, essentially has more of an on projects than you would think. So, if we're focusing on the behavioral part or the cognitive part of project management, we've got about a 70% impact when you use where that behavioral component has about 70% impact on performance versus, for example, just doing technical improvements, which we tend to do a lot of and focus a lot of in or focus on in project management is more technical than behavioral. So that's where some areas where we can make improvements and see greater impacts. So, traditional project management, you would think in terms of phases or knowledge areas. From the behavioral PM perspective, this is kind of more the modalities that we're looking at, where we can make changes to essentially improve decision making, improve human behavior. And so processes is being one of them. We can actually redesign your process, for example, in your planning documentation or risk documentation, even in compliance space. The actual steps you take or the processes that you do in your procedures can actually be redesigned essentially to account for human cognition and result in better decisions. New metrics, formulating kind of new metrics to measure things like optimism bias or optimistic forecasting and how that applies and can be changed through human behavior. And then there's the really interesting part for me is interfaces. So when you think interfaces, it's things like software, even artificial intelligence. So project management software sites, think as selling software or risk software, can be designed in such a way that accounts for human cognition and essentially nudges users to make better decisions or find more risk, create more reliable schedules, et cetera. And then that last part is skills. And so when people hear about behavioral PM, they kind of automatically sometimes think it's more of a teach me skills, but skills, as you can see here, is just a small aspect of how we make improvements in organizations. So essentially, it's process improvement for people and process interaction. So if you think of the process and you think of the people, it's those interactions between the two. And if you can kind of solve, or at least solve some of the human behavior or human cognition issues going on, then essentially those processes can be improved more effectively. And behavioral PM is not a replacement for waterfall or agile or other project management methods. It's essentially just gives more of a solid foundation to all of those methods. It's not meant to replace them. And so if you look at behavioral economics, just using them as a benchmark or an example, when behavioral science got plugged into economics, it's not like economics went away, traditional economics went away, but it did call into question some of the old theories of how we assumed that humans were just purely rational individuals making great decisions on economics. The same thing happens with inserting behavioral science into project management. So then there's the redesign component, and this is what I think is fun, because redesigning essentially means that we can sometimes make tweaks based on what we know about human thinking and not even have to do training around cognitive biases or what have you. So they call this behavioral design. Essentially, it's testing of um, methods that are based in human cognition, kind of applying those to your processes, and then seeing what the optimal outcome is based on that behavioral change. So the end result's obviously better predictions and planning and forecasting, reduced risk, um, uh, more scope capture. And the interesting thing about it is that if you're making some of these changes in the behavioral realm, what we found is that there are correlations between, for example, planning and risk and safety. So, for example, very uh, easy example is if I'm designing the environment for better psychological safety, for example, for planning and risk, I have a residual positive effect on safety in the organization because the same kind of decisions that avoid risk in project management could mean that people are making the same kind of decisions that are avoiding um, safe actions at work. So there's a huge correlation there. So the redesign part is just using this as an example. Um, let's say that we go into the science and we find that a particular action is more useful or helpful, it has better outcomes in project management based on how humans think. We can take that science that we found, and we can essentially create a new process in the organization um, that has better results based on that science. So that's kind of designing your procedures, designing your processes around essentially the brain. Because when we take the study of the brain, we take the study of what we know about it and what causes better decisions, and we essentially proceduralize that or make a new process. And that also includes doing it in software as well. So here's an example, just taken from the PMBOK. You can see the PMBOK 6th edition, these kind of steps that you would take, such as sequence activities, estimate resources, estimate duration, based on what we found in cognitive science using the very simple example of identifying obstacles, which is found in cognitive science. Essentially, we take that, plug it right there in the middle of the process flow, and now essentially we're going to get a little bit better decision making and better outcomes in our planning based on this kind of behavior informed process design. And so in this case, just this case particularly, we don't have to go and train people on cognitive biases so much as we insert steps in the process that result in better decision making. So this is kind of another example of behavioral design. Here is some of the other aspects of behavioral design when it comes to thinking about the environment, sometimes the organizational environment. So for example, if we want to increase better decision making in an organization as a whole, then we have to think about reducing time pressure, um, increasing psychological safety, reducing cognitive load, reducing decision fatigue, etc. So all these things have various aspects on how our brain captures or thinks about information or misses it, right? So time pressure causes us to miss information. Cognitive dissonance may cause us to avoid information. Social pressure may cause us to change information. And so all these various kind of cognitive moderators, or what we call filters of thinking, are essentially filtering out information so that it never even reaches your project management plan or risk analysis. And so that's kind of those unknown unknowns. And if you're work on designing your organization around some of these filters of thinking, what you get is essentially you start capturing more knowns, or capturing more known unknowns. And so this is another important aspect of behavioral project management. So what do we see as the future of behavioral PM? There's going to be a huge area of opportunity with the marriage of behavioral AI with behavioral PM. So essentially, it's using AI as kind in the background to help with facilitated planning, for example, looking at the various moderators of cognition within the organization, et cetera. I mean, there's so much that we can do with AI. We're just barely scratching the surface. Software design, like I was talking about. What we see as the future with software design is that all project management software now has the capability of taking our behavioral PM research and kind of plugging it into the software and using that to kind of redesign the steps in the software that you would take. Building or writing new academic journals for the new science. So taking the behavioral sciences and project management, creating academic journals for those. Developing colleges of study and new degrees for behavioral project management, just like there are already degrees for behavioral economics, for example. So we got a lot of work in universities to do. Behavioral PMOs, which is essentially a PMO designed around the brain, right? So it's more using the behavioral science and the cognitive sciences and neuroscience to essentially result in better decision making across the organization. And then, of course, government adoption of behavioral PM, especially in mega projects and critical and complex projects, because the more complex they are, the more area there is for cognitive load, decision fatigue, time pressure, et cetera. So this is our little team. It's myself, Dr. Shadi Debates, who helped me co-author Neuroplan, Dr. Mel Slater, and then Dr. Wilson. Dr. Jody Wilson was key in being this behavioral project management discipline. She was my mentor originally before I got my PhD. Are there any questions so far before we go into the next section? I know I kind of just talk and talk and talk. Get excited about it. We're holding our questions to the end. No questions so far. All right. So let's talk about planning specifically, because planning is one of those areas where I really love and that I really am passionate about. This is what kind of got me started into behavioral science, which is why we wrote the Neuroplan certification. Let's see if it'll get, there it goes. So behavioral science is really, it's kind of bigger and more impactful, like I said, than what people might originally assume or just reading the title, but it's essentially utilizing the best behavioral design practices and kind of merging those with the best PM practice. Essentially, our goal is to make tweaks, very small tweaks sometimes, that result in the biggest transformation. For example, when I had that example of just plugging that one process into your process flow, and then from there people kind of start making better decisions about the project. So essentially is designing better outcomes right into your organizational processes. So we like to say it's small changes with big results, because sometimes it's even in the most smallest tweak and knowing where to place it that can actually get better results for you. So in planning, we hear a lot about optimism bias. And this is the important part that we have to understand. What we found in the research is that optimism bias isn't necessarily the cause of most optimistic plans. So typically, projects fail between 50 and 70% of the time on their cost and schedule objectives. Now, here at the College of Performance Management, we know all about cost and schedule performance. And so we know what it's like when we see projects that are constantly falling behind. And what we found is that optimism bias itself is not necessarily the cause. As a matter of fact, in most cases, it is not the cause. So what we find is that it is not getting the information needed to create a reliable plan, which means we're missing information. And we miss that information because of our brain inability to capture everything, see everything, predict everything. But there is more predictable out there than what we assume. We get to the execution phase and we see something goes wrong. We're like, okay, well, we missed this in the plan because we just couldn't have known it. And so I did a small pilot study at a Department of Energy project and found that about 65% of the issues that we saw during the execution phase were actually preventable or predictable in the planning phase, but somehow we missed it. And so what effective behavioral science does is it gives us processes and gives us an understanding of the cognitive environment so that our brain essentially captures more and misses less. So it's understanding that optimism bias isn't always the cause. It's not always intentional optimism, although sometimes it can be. But it's other things that cause us to miss information. So, how do we solve that? A lot of it is the sequence of the steps we take, how we organize the processes and how we do those, and what sequence. The anchoring effect bias. It's who asks the planning questions. It's the cognitive environment we plan in. So, remember, I was talking about the filters of thinking earlier. It's how we see the planning data and the type of feedback we get and when. And so optimism bias, once again, isn't always the cause in many times, and in many cases, it's not the cause. So how do we improve the processes? At a very high level, visualization. So essentially, visualizations have been shown to increase decision accuracy and reliability. Feedback, like we just talked about, the type of feedback we get and when and how routine it is, designing the process around what we know about human cognition. This is the very important and key part is taking the processes that we know in the organization or the software, et cetera, and essentially designing them around human cognition. Awareness. So if we train people to be aware of their own biases, so for example, if I know about optimism bias, if I know about confirmation bias, if I know about the anchoring effect, I will essentially start making adjustments myself, maybe even sometimes subconsciously, because I'm aware of that bias. So if we have training around knowing what biases we might have, that awareness actually causes us to make better decisions. And then the intentions, and this is the hard one because we sometimes have unconscious intentions, such as strategic misrepresentation when we intentionally, optimistically plan a project in order to win a bid, for example. So sometimes there's incentives around that. And so knowing what those intentions are. So here's a few things that you can do right away in your projects if you want to start implementing. But before we do that, recognize that there is actual brain science around what we're talking about. They actually go into using an fMRI machine and can actually see some of these things that we're talking about in the brain, such as time pressure. So, what does time pressure do? It essentially, as information comes in, time pressure causes you to default your thinking in what's called system one in behavioral science. And system one essentially causes you to make automatic decisions without putting a lot of thought into it, versus system two, which is more kind of deliberate thinking. So time pressure causes automatic thinking, which has impacts on reduced creativity, decision error increases, bias increases, and then risky decision making increases, among others. So, what are one of the first things we do in planning? Very simple. Unpack your activities into smaller components. It's very simple, very mundane, but I have seen it in many, 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 many cases as project controls scheduler, project controls engineer. Um, we don't unpack our activity sometimes to the detail that's needed. And unpacking is different than just creating detailed activities. It's unpacking it into smaller components to kind of see what's underneath. That doesn't mean that you have to keep the activities long, or it doesn't mean you have to keep all the detail in your schedule. Sometimes that just means unpack it into its smaller subcomponents, identify what those smaller subcomponents are, and then maybe you just repack it up into your higher level activity. So as a scheduler, you might be thinking, well, geez, that's going to be a lot of work. But if we want the outcome, if we want to capture more scope, if we want to identify more risk, unpacking essentially improves cognitive processing more than one might assume. It's not just adding more detail to your schedule. That cognitively essentially allows your brain to process more information that it had not processed before by looking at that high level activity. Like I said, you can always repack it up, but
So, Josh, I have a
if you want to
question for
unpack
you.
it,
This is Dan.
yeah, yeah,
Um, on the slide before, you were talking about there's a time pressure,
yep.
and then you jumped into unpacking it per se. Can you speak a little bit more about how the unpacking it gives relief on the time pressure, if in fact it does at all?
Well, I think what it does is it causes us to slow down our thinking where we tend to rush, right? For example, I've seen it, and many times in a meeting where it's like someone will say, well, we don't have time for that, right? They feel cognitively rushed. But then I see that same person walk down the hall and spend 20 minutes leaning on the door talking about football, right? So, it's often the perception of time pressure. And what unpacking does is it essentially not only helps you to cognitively process, but it forces you kind of to slow down your thinking and think about each subcomponent, if that makes any sense.
It does. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and essentially, and what I was about to say too is that unpacking is not just a project management or schedule thing. Essentially, what they found is that unpacking causes us to process information better in any situation, whether it's project management or anything, even in your personal life. So it's very important from a cognitive aspect. It's like I said, it seems sometimes mundane and simple, but if we're not doing it, then we're not having the getting the results.
Yeah, the same premise also fits when you're at the beginning of a contract award and you're breaking down the WBS. It also seems that it
Yep.
would work that way as well, almost in
Yep.
concert with the planning process.
Yes. Yep. Uh, yeah, you should be doing unpacking and scope capture. You should be doing unpacking activity development, unpacking in your risk, unpacking in your resource estimation. Essentially, you should unpack everything. And but the problem too is under time pressure, um, we tend to default to biased thinking as well. And because of that, we miss a lot, or we may not want to cognitively process the unpacking process. If that kind of sounds redundant, but um, essentially, time pressure causes us to um, feel like we're under more cognitive load and resist the type of things that we need to do in order to create a more effective plan. So it really is, in many cases, a kind of a mental error that we take under in project management. And I've seen it for years, because we, under time pressure, often feel like there's not enough time to do something. And then if we unpack it, what we find is that we had more time to do something, or we spend too much time in, coloring up the proposal and not enough time in making the prediction, because the prediction actually sets the milestone and we're going to have to work to that milestone later. So that unpacking kind of helps deal with that as well.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Piece is putting realities into visuals. Data in spreadsheets is not as effective if you're trying to get better decision making. So Something as simple as opening up the Gantt chart and not focusing too much on the columns in P6, if we're using P6 as an example. I've seen in many cases the schedule forecasting session when someone is updating the schedule with their CAM or their PM, and they've got like this much of the Gantt chart open, and this whole side of their screen over here is the columns in P6, like remaining duration and earned value method and activity description, and 6 different P6 code columns, and they got this much of the Gantt chart open. Well, sometimes it's as simple as, let's open up the Gantt chart this big and minimize the columns over here. Because if I can visually show the CAM and the PM, the impact and the sequence of activities that are going on, essentially they're going to make better decisions and they're going to see more. So sometimes it's as simple as changing the visualizations when you're doing any kind of planning, prediction, risk analysis, etc. And I'm kind of oversimplifying a bit, but it's very important. The other aspect is facilitating the planning. So the project controls engineer, and I'm going to use project controls because I know we're in the CPM world here, and that's where a lot of my experience is. But facilitating the planning is extremely important here. And this is where project controls engineers, schedulers, cost analysts who are helping in the planning and the forecasting process become absolutely essential. We shouldn't view our project controls engineers as just a support organization that just helps the PM and takes data from the CAM and plugs it into the software. The PCE, or project controls analyst, whatever you call them in your organization, essentially should be the one who is facilitating the planning with the CAM or the PM. Because what we found in the science is that people tend to plan their own projects more optimistically than people who are external to the project. So as a CAM or PM, I will tend to be more optimistic in my own planning of my own project. But if the project controls analyst is helping me create the schedule, they can be the facilitator that helps me get more reliable planning because I am too optimistic about my own work. So if it's facilitating any of the planning, facilitating that forecast is very, very important that you have that external person. And it also has an impact on optimism bias itself. By the way, this is your brain on optimism bias. So what we're seeing is that there is physical hard science behind what we see in defaulted thinking, system one thinking under time pressure, and optimism bias. And there are so many more studies on risk and confirmation bias, all of these things which have been observed in the brain through fMRI. So you can think about your brain as kind of like a computer. It is hardwired for certain things, and it will always be that way. You can't really change it with just thinking that, well, if I drink more coffee, I'll feel better, or, there are certain things that are just defaulted into your brain a certain way. So here's another important aspect of planning. And if you want to get more reliable plans, ask how much effort it takes, not how long it will take. So what we found in the research is that just asking how long is this activity going to take to complete? And the camera PM saying, oh, I think about 10 days. That's absolutely the worst question you can ask during the planning process, asking how long something will take. Your duration should always be derived from something. So what they also found is that if you ask how much effort it takes, you get a more reliable duration. You get a more reliable estimate of resources versus asking how long something will take. So part of this behavioral design process is knowing which words are more effective when you ask the questions and in which sequence you're asking the questions. Focus on the obstacles. So remember we were talking about that obstacle identification. in some of the processes earlier. So using the word obstacles is more effective when doing planning and forecasting, essentially any prediction that you're making, whether it's scope capture, risk analysis, resource estimation. Ask about what are the obstacles to activity completion. Because essentially what that does is it opens up the brain to start thinking about things that it may have not thought about before. And here's kind of the counterintuitive reframe on that. What they found is that if we focus on obstacles and not goals, we get better predictions. And we tend to focus a lot on goals, like, okay, we have to finish this thing by X date. But that's not the right frame. We got to reframe around what are the obstacles to completing this objective and focus less on meeting the objective and what that goal is. Because if we focus on identifying the obstacles, essentially we have a higher probability of meeting that goal. So I often get the question, well, what about risk? Because I'm already doing risk identification. I'm already doing risk analysis. Why do I need to focus on obstacles? And the simple answer is obstacles are different from the brain's perspective than risk, because obstacles are those things that will occur, and risks are things that may or may not occur. And if I ask someone, what is the risk in this particular activity? And their brain goes to this thing, this bad thing, which may or may not occur, that could cause them mental discomfort, also known as cognitive dissonance. And so when it causes mental discomfort, they may want to try to avoid that discomfort, which means they'll either assign a lower probability to the risk, or they'll just leave it out of the risk plan altogether. Maybe they won't even mention it, right? So risks kind of give us an out, although you still have to identify risk. What we're saying is that obstacles are different than risk, because risk may or may not occur, which may or may not cause mental discomfort, which means that you may not get it included in your plan. Obstacles are those things that will occur, and it's from the brain's perspective, it's a little bit more comfortable than talking about risk. And here's your brain on risk, just so you know. There are a lot of studies on risk, by the way, because in cognitive science, risk is one of those central functions of human decision making, and kind of how we look at the world through the lens of our own personal safety, which tends to always go towards risk. And then the last, well, not the last, but another big part of the planning or forecasting process and getting better prediction is always ask questions. Essentially, your brain is an association machine. And so if you just ask questions, essentially you're opening up these like pathways for your brain to kind of start considering different options, even subconsciously. We don't even have to think about it many times. If someone asks you a question, your brain's going to just start going different routes. And I'll kind of just give you a quick example, because it's an association machine. Essentially, it's constantly making connections and links to things it knows or thinks it knows. So a quick example is if I ask you to think about a car, you might think of driving in the mountains, or you might think of driving near the beach, or driving at sunset. And if you're driving near the beach, you maybe think about driving with your family or with your spouse. And if as soon as your brain thinks about driving with your spouse, you think, okay, well, maybe I'm driving at sunset with my spouse to go sit on the beach, right? And so your brain can, as soon as you ask a question, your brain can start making all these associations based on memories, things it knows, and putting it all together. That's why sleeping on something is so effective, because essentially your brain starts going out and making all these different associations. And then you can wake up in the morning and like, oh, I got it, right? And so Ask, if nothing else, everything is going to come from asking questions. Ask questions. So I wanted to do this kind of last part here for kind of a simple, sort of simple example of diagnosing your organization in terms of, okay, if you see optimistic planning going on, which all of us have. I'm not aware of any project yet that tends to be more pessimistic than optimistic. And so we have this thing in the Neuroplan manual called qualitative prediction diagnostics, which is essentially trying to figure out what's going on in the organization that's causing me to have optimistic planning. So it kind of falls into two categories. Not enough information, because remember we were talking about it's not always optimism bias. So either I don't have enough information to have created a reliable plan, or I have enough information to create a reliable plan. So if you don't have enough information, then what is kind of the first thing you should look at? Very simply, it's why wasn't the information available? Which goes to simple things like, were the resources and their availability visible? Were there benchmarks and lessons learned? Did we have risk and obstacles that were unknown, right? Kind of some of those very technical, easy processes that we deal with every day in our projects. But then we have this kind of other aspect of not having enough information. So if you don't have enough information, maybe it just wasn't found. But what if we didn't seek the information? And remember that I was talking about that 65% of predictable, preventable events that were known somewhere in the organization before, but somehow not captured. So maybe we didn't seek the information. And this is where it starts to get more behavioral than technical. So maybe we didn't seek the information because the organization has too high cognitive load, there's too much time pressure, there's too much inertia or decision fatigue. And this becomes more of an organizational, high level, portfolio level thing. So if your organization is under high time pressure, high cognitive load, high decision fatigue all the time, you're going to miss more. And if you're not slowing it down enough, or you're not providing the space enough to create those more accurate plans, then essentially you're going to get automatic thinking. And so maybe you didn't even seek the information out. And then this is where this far right-hand side is where it gets kind of really sticky. And this is kind of more deliberate optimism or pessimism. And this is where we fall into the intention category. And one of these big ones is strategic misrepresentation, which is essentially lying on a plan or a proposal, creating it intentionally optimistic in order to win the bid. There's also things like deliberate ignorance, also called the ostrich effect, or intentional overconfidence. So this is kind of an oversimplified way of looking at it. But if I was to walk into an organization today and you had optimistic plans left and right, or optimistic forecasts, and I wanted to try to solve that and accelerate some of the work, these are the kind of the first steps I would take to see if the information was even available for the PM or the CAM to make an accurate plan. And if it wasn't, if there wasn't enough information, was it because it wasn't found, it wasn't sought, or if both of those categories have kind of been resolved and you realize it wasn't one of those things, then you move to the far right hand side and you say, it was some of this actually intentional in some form or fashion, intentionally optimistic. So I can say that, and since the NDIA conference back in May, we were still kind of measuring, and so we continued a little bit more, a few more pilot studies since then, and got up to 80% improvement in planning and forecasting with some of these methods. So it does have a material impact on the outcomes of your projects. So we're getting towards the end, but I wanted to kind of leave you guys with this. If you wanted to take a picture or follow me on LinkedIn, I also posted this out there as well. But it's kind of an easy 5 steps that you can kind of take to your organization today. Kind of a little bit of advice on getting better scope capture, risk analysis, better planning, more reliable planning. And it's essentially slow your thinking. Remember, sometimes we're under perceived time pressure. And so you have to slow your thinking, if even for a couple of minutes, because essentially what you're doing is you're allowing your brain to process stuff and get out of system 1 and into system 2. Unpack those activities like we talked about. Consider the opposite. This is countering the confirmation bias. So we tend to seek information that confirms what we already believe. For example, we know a risk may be uncomfortable, so we go seek information that confirms that the risk is actually not as bad as what we think it is, or we'll assign a lower probability. You need to consider the opposite. Could this risk be actually more impactful than less, right? Identify the obstacles, which we talked about, and then derive durations. Durations should never be calculated or put into the schedule, etc., by just asking how long will this take. Durations should always be derived from something, i.e., unpack it, estimate the resources and their availability per day, and then create the duration based on that estimation. So sometimes, remember, like I said, it's very mundane, but it's tweaking your processes based on how the brain thinks versus just saying, hey, go estimate this resource quantity or go estimate the duration. We should be doing those things based on how the brain works. And that's how we get kind of more effective processes. And of course, you can read all about it if you take the Neuroplan course, which is available online. There is the what do they call those? QR codes or something of that. What do they call that, Dan?
I knew you would ask me, and I have no idea. I think it's a QR code.
Yeah. So if you scan that with your phone, it'll take you directly to the Neuroplan website if you want to look at that a little bit more. And then, of course, that is the QR code to our Institute for Neuro and Behavioral Project Management, which you can become a member of for free. And there's our email. And with that, I appreciate the opportunity to present to you guys and open it up to any questions you have.
Yeah, we've got like 5 minutes left out of respect for everybody's time. If you've been holding on to your questions, I didn't see anything in the chat that maybe you wanted to get your thought down and we could do it later. I'm going to leave it up to the folks that are here. There's about 7 or 8 of us online. And if you have any questions for Josh, feel free to ask him now. But I think he's given you enough information if you wanted to drop him an email. I do suggest you follow him on LinkedIn. He's got some really good stuff out there. I've been following him for a while. And I might have even learned something. I don't, yeah, even at my advanced years, I actually think, folks, you can learn something from this stuff. So I'm just going to leave it open here for another second or two. If you have a question, I'll be quiet and you can speak up now. Okay, I'll take that as a signal that we don't have any questions at the moment. Josh, my sincere thanks. I really appreciate you coming on here and supporting CPM with this webinar. As you progress in your studies and your information, please feel free to come back and talk to us about an update. If you got more information and stuff. And I would encourage everyone to follow Josh and start to think about this behavioral aspect of project management. I think it's pretty fascinating. So with that, if there's any questions, I don't see any on the board. Please get a hold of Josh if you want to afterwards. And again, Josh, sincere thanks from everybody on the board of directors from CPM. We really
My
appreciate having you here.
my thanks for the invitation for sure.
Our pleasure.